Shalom, shalom. Welcome to part 6 of the 2016 Pesach special here on Scroll to Scroll. Now, for you keen observers out there, I'm sure you can take a look and see that maybe some time has passed from the end of video 5 to this one. I enjoyed my Shabbat immensely, though I was working to get as much of those videos done as possible. And here we are on the first day of the week, wrapping this up with a study on Mount Sinai. Also, since the end of video 5, I realized that the good people at Vimeo that host my videos, they swapped the day that I get my 5 gigabyte allotment of space, and they didn't really tell me about it. And so what ends up happening is I didn't realize that I have to wait until Wednesday to get my allotment reset. And because I had a double Parsha plus all those other videos, I ran out of space. Now, why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because you will no doubt notice that some of these videos, I'm thinking 2 of them, will be YouTube links because I don't have space to put them on Vimeo. I just have to link them to YouTube. And for the folks that tune into my YouTube channel, I didn't want to just put up 2 videos. It's a free open teaching anyway, because they're going to be like, well, where are the other 4? So for the first time, due to this little weird thing with Vimeo, the Pesach special will also be on YouTube. The only question is, will I keep it up there? Because when my allotment returns, I may simply put the stuff on Vimeo and take the versions on YouTube down. You guys won't know the difference really, except that when you're watching them, it won't say Vimeo, it'll say YouTube. So I just wanted to let you guys know about that, because even though this is a free and open teaching, my priority is always to current members. As much as I like people watching Genesis Decoded and Walking Dedicated Men, getting interested in the ministry, it really gets taken up a notch when they actually become members, because guys like you, ladies and gentlemen like you, are the reason I'm able to do this. So just wanted to let you know that's in the 4 years that I have had a Vimeo account, I have never ever gone over the 5 gigabyte space that I have. But first time for everything, so we just got to roll with it. By this time, I'm hoping that all of you are getting ready and gearing up for a beautiful feast. And we certainly are here in the Roth household. We're going to have a lot of friends over here, do a real Seder. And we're even looking forward to doing another Seder in April, believe it or not. Because for us, that will be second Passover. So anyway, that out of the way, let's get into the last part of the Pesach special, which is Finding Mount Sinai and Other Mysteries Revealed. This is part of material that I first presented at last year's Exodus Revealed Conference, which was March 21st and 22nd of 2015. And the research into this is ongoing. I mean, I believe my conclusions are fairly stabilized here. But the little details about what we've been finding, what we've been exploring together, that's constantly being updated. And that's one of the things that I love about what I do. Even though we're dealing with stuff that happened 4 millennia ago, it's always fresh and new. No matter how much time you spend in it or how often you're reading in it, it's always something new. What a blessing. Okay, so let's talk about Mount Sinai. It may be the most baffling mystery of them all. Where is Mount Sinai? Starting with the most obvious candidate, according to the 4th century Christian tradition, which is Jebel Musa, the Mount of Moses. But that mountain that all the tourists go to, where St. Catherine's Monastery is not the right location. Okay? And if you go there, you'll see right away why it doesn't work. Okay? Just go there at one point when you can, and you are out in the middle of nowhere. You have no appreciable water supply, how are you going to have 2 million people camping beneath the mountain? It's one thing to say, well, Father Yah can take 2 million people through a route to the wilderness and know where the water is and know where the supplies are. And if they're not there, he rains down manna and quail and all that. But it's quite another to have the Israelites settle in a place where the logistics don't match up to what is needed for them to be at. And that is the case with Jebel Musa. There's no way the base of that mountain can support 2 million Israelites. So if we want to take Jebel Musa and say this is the Mount Sinai, then we have to say that the scripture is wrong. There weren't that many people there. They weren't there for that long, and so on and so forth. So I'm sorry. I don't even think there's a decent cave for Elijah to stay in, because that happened in the Book of Kings, that Elijah went to Mount Sinai. Josephus tells us that Mount Sinai is a single peak. Jebel Musa is actually one of 3 peaks, and it's not even the highest of the 3. In fact, the evidence in favor of this traditional site is amazingly thin. It's a Greek Orthodox tradition. There have been attempts to say that there was an earlier Jewish tradition. I find those arguments totally unpersuasive. And so if we know that Jebel Musa is not Mount Sinai, well, where is it? And here's another question. Do we even know that Mount Sinai and Mount Horeb are one and the same mountain? Well, for about 12 years, I said, no way Jebel Musa is Mount Sinai. And I didn't even think Mount Sinai was in the Sinai. I thought it was in Saudi Arabia. I got, several books on the subject, and I was devouring those books, and I was watching a whole bunch of videos on the internet, and I was like, I was so fired up for Saudi Arabia to be Mount Sinai. So much so that at one point I was trying to figure out how someone could get permission from the Saudi government, when they're not a Muslim, to go to where I thought Mount Sinai was. And, it was a long-standing but highly impractical dream that I had, and no more, because it isn't there. Okay? No, there's no reason to risk your life going to a place where the mountain isn't. So, 12 years of my life, Mount Sinai is Jebel El-Lawz. Mount Sinai is Jebel El-Lawz. And then a couple years ago, I hit a brick wall, proverbial brick wall. And I came to understand that the case for Jebel El-Lawz rests on several unworkable assumptions. And not just Jebel El-Lawz, but all of the potential mountains that are in Saudi Arabia are eliminated in the research that has come about since. So let's go through these assumptions and look at the scripture. Okay? Assumption number 1. Mount Sinai is in Midian, and therefore Mount Sinai is in Saudi Arabia, because Midian is in Saudi Arabia. That's the assumption. Here's the reality. The reality is Jethro is in Midian. Midian is in Saudi Arabia, but Mount Sinai is not in Midian or in Saudi Arabia. See, why do folks decouple the natural alignment between the wilderness of Sinai, the Sinai Peninsula, and the mountain called Sinai, and transport it hundreds and hundreds of miles to a place where there is no such wilderness of Sinai or Sinai Peninsula? Why did that happen? Well, it happened because of a number of very determined biblical enthusiasts, guys like Colin Humphreys, Dr. Colin Humphreys of Cambridge, Dr. Frank Moore Cross of Harvard University, and in particular, of course, we can't leave out Ron Wyatt, and Howard Blum and Bob Kernook and Larry Williams. These people, were extremely compelling in their presentations and passionate in their beliefs, and it began to turn people around, especially with Ron Wyatt starting in the early 1980s. But you see, the problem is the scripture itself tells me that Mount Sinai is not in Midian. Okay? But before I get to that, let me explain why people were so sure that it was. Exodus 3:1 says, and Moshe, actually I'll read it from the Tanakh, that's why it's here. Just bear with me for a second. Exodus, Shemot 3:1. Now Moshe was tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. Now, Jethro is in Midian. Moshe is in Midian. He's tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro. Right? And it says, and he came to Horeb, the mountain of Elohim. So the natural assumption is Mount Sinai, or Horeb, is in Midian, because it's where Jethro pastures his flocks, and Jethro and Moshe are in Midian. I get it. But there's a little bit of a line that people forget. The actual line is, now Moshe, tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, priest of Midian, drove the flock into the wilderness. Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb, is in the wilderness. It's not in a settled place like Midian. Okay? And as if that's not enough of a problem, Moshe himself says that Mount Sinai is not in Midian. A couple of times. He says, and Moshe sent off his father-in-law, and he went away to his own land. That's Exodus 18, verse 27. So Jethro had visited Moshe at Mount Sinai. But then he had to go back to his homeland. Right? Exodus 18:5 says that Jethro and Moshe met at the mountain of Elohim in the wilderness. Well, we just established that's not Midian. And we've established it a second time because Jethro says, I need to go back home. Where's home? Midian. Now, some would say that maybe this phrase, his own land, doesn't necessarily mean his own country. It might mean a property or a homestead or whatever. But I've tracked this exact phrase, or so, 24 times in Tanakh. Every single place that word appears, it is always about a country. It is never about personal real estate, not once. So I'm sorry. Jethro leaves Sinai, leaves Horeb to return to his home country, because his home country is not in the wilderness. His home country is in Midian. Here's another one. And Moshe said to Hobab, the son of Ruel, the Midianite, Moshe's father-in-law, we are setting out for the place of which Yahweh said, I give it to you. And he replied to him, I am not going, but I am going where? Where am I going? I'm going back to my own land and to my relatives, which is where? Midian. Where are they at? Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai, not Midian. Okay. So if Mount Sinai is not in Midian and it's not in Saudi Arabia, then it can't be at Jebel el-Lawz, and it can't be at any of the other mountains in Saudi Arabia either. But let's get to the next problematic assumption. A lot of folks, they realize that it seems kind of obvious that Mount Sinai would be in the wilderness of Sinai, right? But in order to decouple that, to make their Saudi Arabia hypothesis more palatable, and, I don't say this with any disrespect to these folks. I was in their number. Not only did I believe it, I was an enthusiastic believer of it, So, but you see, what they say is, this is the assumption. The assumption is that the Sinai Peninsula is in Egyptian territory. And therefore, it's not practical for the Israelites to stay in Egypt as they're leaving Egypt. That's the assumption. Okay? But the reality is something quite different. Just writing this for half a second here. Okay. The reality is that the Sinai Peninsula was not Egyptian territory at the time of the Exodus. It was a buffer area. It was, wilderness. Just like the text says. If wilderness is this unsettled area that's outside of a place like Midian, it is also an unsettled area that is outside of Egypt. Okay? And so Egypt annexed the Mount Sinai, the Sinai Peninsula, only in modern times. Now this gets confusing. People will push back and say, Andrew, there are army out there. There are the remains of Egyptian forts out in the Sinai. There are Egyptian mines like Serabit el-Qadim that are out in the Sinai. With Egyptian gods. There's guard posts. There are signs of Egyptian habitation. That's true. But that doesn't mean it was part of Egypt. See, Egypt was not like other empires. Other empires, like Rome, for example. Rome was all about expansion. Rome was all about, okay, I'm going to grab you, you're going to pay taxes to me, you're going to be a province, you're going to be a tributary of us, whatever. Egypt could care less about any place outside of their borders. In Egyptian mentality, Egypt was paradise and everything outside was hell. Okay? Now, what happens is Egypt felt the need to patrol the buffer area. Why? Because you've got all sorts of enemies. You've got the Nubians to your south. You've got the Hittites to your west. And you've got other, the Mitanni and some of these other folks that are all sort of like looking to encroach upon you. So it makes sense that you're going to have forts and you're going to have some presence out in the buffer area only to protect your homeland. And that's what the Egyptians did. And they've got a long history of occupying no man's land, buffer areas, to anywhere that they felt that somebody might be able to come in. The other thing is that they thought that they could spread their cultural influence in the Sinai Peninsula, that people could start thinking more Egyptian as opposed to thinking more Hittite-like. Okay? And that's why you have these turquoise mines that are in the Sinai that were dedicated to an Egyptian goddess. Okay? And that was a way of expanding their cultural brand beyond their borders. Alexander the Great did a lot of the same thing. Even in places where he didn't necessarily conquer, he was building Greek stuff in the buffer areas so that people would go, oh yeah, to be Greek means I can go to the gladiator games, I can do this, I can do that, I can go to Hippodrome, I can see a play. That's what they did. But that doesn't mean that their people occupied and annexed the Sinai. The Sinai was not part of ancient Egypt's borders. The other reason that I know is because Moshe tells me so. Exodus 13 verse 3. And Moshe said to the people, remember this day. What is this day? 15th, right? They're just on the road when you went out of Mitzrayim. So by the end of the 15th, they are out of Egypt's borders. They're in another country. But others will say, wait a minute, Andrew. That contradicts the Apostle Paul. That contradicts Galatians. Why do they think that? Because of what Paul says here in 4:24 through 25, where he goes, therefore, these things were symbolic of two covenants. The one from Mount Sinai gave birth to bondage, which is Hagar, For Hagar is that mountain that is in Arabia. Now that's where a lot of the Saudi Arabia stuff comes from. Paul is saying Mount Sinai is in Arabia. But does Arabia mean Saudi Arabia? No, it doesn't. See, Paul was extremely well educated. And he had read all the classics about geography, including guys like Strabo. He would have read Herodotus. He would have read Pliny. And these guys all did a lot of geography that the rest of the people looked at as the standard geography for the Mediterranean. Okay? And every single geographical source that Paul would have studied, without exception, would say that Arabia is from the wilderness before Egypt to the Persian Gulf. In other words, it's an area that is roughly 5 times more massive than the country that we call Saudi Arabia. The moment they left Egypt, they entered into Arabia, what you might call Greater Arabia. And Greater Arabia encompassed the entire Sinai wilderness. Okay? And that's why when you're reading in the Tanakh, there'll be times when they have echoes of that, where they talk about the Araba, Greater Arabia. You see? Because that borders on Edomite territory and Moabite territory. You can look it up on a map. Okay? So, therefore, Saudi Arabia is included in Greater Arabia, but Greater Arabia includes a lot more land, and it does not prove that they were in Saudi Arabia. So that's the second problematic assumption. Third problematic assumption. Archaeological evidence of Israelite habitation only applies to Jebel el-Lawz. I've seen a lot of videos on this. Only here, they will say. Look, here's a menorah petroglyph. Look, here's a petroglyph of a calf. Look, here's like the Ten Commandments or whatever. And some of that is compelling. Here's the thing. Menorah petroglyphs, calf petroglyphs, Ten Commandments petroglyphs. I've got the pictures to prove it. Have been found also in the Sinai Peninsula. And unlike Saudi Arabia, they are not 1,000 years too late. Because a lot of that stuff in Saudi Arabia is Nabatean. Okay? But in addition to that, there have been found unique Semitic scripts in the Sinai Peninsula that have not been found in Saudi Arabia. Okay? And that's why one of the earliest of all Hebrew scripts is called Proto-Sinaitic. Not Paleo-Hebrew. Proto-Sinaitic precedes Paleo-Hebrew. And Phoenician and some of these other ones. So, the Israelites existed in the Sinai Peninsula, and there's basically nothing at Jebel el-Lawz that is exclusive to Jebel el-Lawz that you can point to and say, aha, here's evidence of ancient Hebrew occupation, and it exists nowhere else, and only here is it dated to 1400 BC, and so on and so on. You cannot say that. It isn't true. But other times, people make claims that either by accident or design simply cannot withstand scholarly scrutiny. I'm talking about a certain nurse anesthetist named Ron Wyatt. Okay? Now, Ron, a lot of folks in Hebrew roots are totally disillusioned with Ron Wyatt. A lot of Christians are disillusioned with Ron Wyatt. Believe it or not, I have a bit more of grace to Ron. Simply because for a long time I believed that half of his theories were right. I never believed that the Ark of the Covenant was in a antechamber underneath Jerusalem that he saw. I don't believe that happened, because even if you could say the Ark was in Jerusalem and that the Ark had survived, the antechamber would not have survived. There was no antechamber for Mr. Wyatt to look in because the Roman destruction layer went beneath the foundation stones by 20 feet. So there's just no way, okay? But because I respected what Ron was saying about other things, even though I don't disagree with him now, I don't agree with him any longer on those things, I'm willing to give Ron some of the benefit of the doubt on some of this. But there are just other things that, I'm sorry, they cannot be true. Okay? You know, does that mean I'm saying he lied? I'm not going to, you know, he may have convinced himself of something that was not true. He may have meant well, but it isn't true. Okay? Okay, Andrew, what are you talking about? What you going on about this time? Remember that famous chariot wheel that was found, supposedly, in the Gulf of Aqaba, encrusted in coral? Remember that? And I went on Ron Wyatt's website, and even in the coral encrusted form, I could tell it had 4 spokes. And then they had a restored picture where it had four spokes, and it was a shiny wheel. Could the 4-spoked wheel be from the time of Exodus to make the connection to the Saudi Arabian Mount Sinai? Because if they crossed at the Gulf of Aqaba, then they went into Saudi Arabia. There'll be no doubt that if one is true, the other is also true. Well, the answer is no. Okay? And that is a resounding universal scholarly no. Why can I be so sure? Because the Egyptians had abandoned the 4-spoked wheel long before Moshe's time. This is the history, okay? For a long, long time, the Egyptians didn't even have the regular wheel, let alone wagon wheels, let alone chariot wheels. When they built the pyramid, they did not have wheels, okay? Then, slowly, they developed wheels and carts and wagons and stuff like that. And then, in about 1570 BCE, these invaders from the north, called the Hyksos, come in with horses and with chariots. The Egyptians had never seen either of those things. Okay? They didn't even have a word for horse. Okay? Now, the Hyksos come in with what is the ancient equivalent of a bunch of tanks. Okay? And they kick the Thebans' butt. They wiped the floor with them. And they pushed the native Egyptians out of the northern half of the country. And now the country is split. Okay? And so for 108 years, the northern half is being ruled by foreigners. Well, the native Egyptian rulers, they're not taking this laying down. So they spend their time inventing their own chariot. And that's when they started trying out the 4-spoke chariot. Okay? So this would be about 50 years before Moshe is born. And they found that a 4-spoke chariot wheel had very little stability. So then they decided that they would switch to an 8-spoked wheel, which they did very briefly. The 8-spoked wheel really slowed them down. You know, so they settled, like any good engineer, they go, 4 didn't work, 8 didn't work, we're going to settle on 6. And that is, we got war chariots like from Thutmose III. We got pictures of them, and Thutmose III was the pharaoh just before Exodus. So we got a snapshot of the types of chariots that the ancient Egyptians were using 3 years before Exodus. And guess what? 6 spokes. So Ron, whatever you found, it does not relate to the Exodus. Now there have been some folks who pushed back on this and said, well, wait a minute, Andrew. Here's a picture from King Tut's tomb, and here's a chariot that was reconstructed, and it has 4 spokes. Yes. But it's not a war chariot. It's a ceremonial chariot. And when you want to just have it look pretty and not really go too many places and not be, trying to maneuver on hard desert gravel and stuff like that, fine, you can have your 4-spoke chariot wheel. But it cannot be a war chariot that Pharaoh or one of Pharaoh's soldiers would have driven to chase Moshe. And that's the point. If it's a war chariot, it must be 6-spoke wheels. So Ron, even if your find is authentic, which I don't think it is, but let's say it is, let's say the carbon dates come back and it's all good, that is not a remnant of the Egyptian host. It cannot be. And since it cannot be, you have not proven that they had to cross at Aqaba. Now, here's the other thing. Getting back to Midian. Let's just assume, and I'm being really, really nice here. Let me show you how generous I'm going to be. And I want to be generous and give grace because I used to believe this. Okay? Let's say, for the sake of argument, that the artifacts that have been found at Jebel El-Lawz are authentically Hebrew, which they're not, by the way. They're Nabatean. Okay? But let's just say they're authentically Hebrew. Let's say they come from the right time, 3,500 years ago. And, you found all your menorahs and you found all your kosher stuff. And there's no doubt that 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, there was an Israelite encampment that was at or near Jebel El-Lawz. Let's just say that that is the truth. I have another explanation for all that being there without Jebel El-Lawz being Mount Sinai. Midian is definitely located in Saudi Arabia, as I said, and that is in where Jebel El-Lawz rests. And it's certain that Jethro was a priest to Abba Yahweh in Midian. Right? And it's certain that when they drove their flocks, when Moshe drove the flocks into the wilderness, that was part of Jethro's sort of sphere of influence. Now let me get into this aspect for a little bit too. People say, well, Andrew, wouldn't it make sense, again, going back to Exodus 3, again, I see what you're saying, but why wouldn't it be a wilderness area? Why would you want to put the wilderness so far outside of Midian? Here's why. People go, that seems impractical. It's not. You ever hear of the great cattle drives that we used to do in this country? I think we still do them, right? Yeah, there was a very famous cattle drive that was done, I think, I'm trying to remember. You guys that watch me in Texas are probably going to be a little disappointed. I can't remember exactly where it was, but I'm thinking somewhere from San Antonio, right, to Abilene, Kansas, which is like 1,000+ miles. They would drive their cattle into the wilderness. They would do a cattle drive. So a grazing area can extend many, many hundreds of miles from the home base. And it was the job of the shepherds to maintain those grazing lands and to regularly take the cattle from one place to another. As the weather changed in particular, it would be important to drive them from one place to the other. If it was either going to get too hot or too cold, there's a lot of temperature extremes in the desert. There would be a lot of times when you would have to say, listen, we got to drive the flock out. We got to put them over here outside of Midian. We're going to put them in the other place. And so just because Jethro's from Midian doesn't mean his grazing area is in Midian. And the scripture is saying it is definitely outside of Midian. Okay? But getting back to the evidence of Hebrew, Jewish, Israelite, whatever you like, ancient occupation in Saudi Arabia. True. Absolutely true. But not because they were Moshe's, not because that was where Mount Sinai was. You see, here's the thing. Even according to Islamic tradition, there were Jews in Saudi Arabia for thousands and thousands of years before their faith arose. And it's also true that in the Islamic faith, they look at guys like Job and Jethro as their fathers. Okay, they call them the obedient. I think is the Muslim term. The obedient for the people they think are Muslims before Muhammad. Okay, and I know that sounds really weird to us coming from a Torah viewpoint, but that's nevertheless what they believe, and so that belief arises from the very real historical fact that there were a whole bunch of Jews in Saudi Arabia, including in and around Jebel al-Lawz. So of course they left their menorah stuff and their other stuff there. No big deal. By the way, the other reason that we know that Jews were there, Midian is actually Medina. Yeah. And Medina is the second most important city in Islam. It was the first city to embrace Muhammad. But you know who didn't embrace him? The Jews. You know what happened to the Jews in Midian? So, of course, since everyone agrees there were ancient groups of Hebrew people, there's going to be ancient Hebrew artifacts. Doesn't prove Jebel al-Lawz or any other mountain in that country of Saudi Arabia is in fact Mount Sinai. So now I think that Saudi Arabia is eliminated from contention. At least for me it is. And that leaves, there's only one other place, if you're going to cut out the Gulf of Aqaba. You know, it's funny because even the people who think Mount Sinai is in the Gulf of Aqaba, they can't decide where the crossing point was. Some think it's this thing called Nuweiba Beach. Other people think it's called the Tyrian Straits. And they can't agree. But if you eliminate Saudi Arabia, you eliminate both. And there's only one other place. It's called the Gulf of Suez. It's the only other finger of the Sea of Reeds. And by the way, it's sort of in Egyptian territory. That is the part of the Sea of Reeds that Moshe, as a prince of Egypt, would have been familiar with. So when he's saying we're going to go and cross over at the Sea of Reeds, that's the part of the Sea of Reeds that Moshe, the Egyptian prince, grew up knowing about. How do I know that? Because when the plague of locusts comes, which I believe is in Exodus chapter 10, you had the great east wind bring them, and a great west wind blew them back where? Into the Sea of Reeds. And that is Suez. So, that is, within a couple of miles of what we now call Suez City, that is where Israel crossed. I'm sure of it. But now we need to shift gears and take a new approach to find Mount Sinai. And because you know what? There's a whole bunch of other mountains other than the one I think it is that are in the right area. So how do we know which one it is? Well, one way to do it is to sort of look at what the Israelites needed on their journey. They kind of have a little bit of a shopping list. There's 2 million of them. There's a lot of cattle. There's women. There's children. You got to feed them. You got to get them plenty of water. They have to have provisions for their journey. Okay? And once you figure out what they already had, and then you add to it what the Egyptians gave them, and then you look at what the Torah says they need, if what they need is something that they don't have from the Egyptians or from when they were slaves, they can only get those things on the journey. And once you know that they need to get X, Y, Z on their itinerary, you know where their itinerary is, because there's really only one route that they can go to get the stuff. Okay? So, let's read about this in a little more detail. Exodus 12, 34 through 36, and 38. And the people took their dough before it was leavened, having their kneading bowls bound up on their garments on their shoulders, and the children of Israel had done according to the word of Moshe. And they had asked for from the Mitzrites, objects of silver, gold, and garments. And Yahweh gave the people favor in the eyes of the Mitzrites, so they gave them what they asked, and they plundered the Mitzrites. And then it says, and they baked unleavened cakes, because it was not leavened, since they were driven out of Mitzrayim, nor had they prepared food or made provision for themselves. Okay, so except for some gold, some silver, some clothing, their kneading bowls, whatever they could throw on their back, everything else has to come on the road. Now we know they left with some weapons, according to Exodus 12, verse 51. So that's one thing that at least they have some of. Josephus says he believes they got more weapons from the soldiers dead at the Sea of Reeds, so maybe that helped a little bit more. And silver, gold, clothing. But again, what about the rest? Where are they going to get copper? Where are they going to get semi-precious stones like turquoise, rubies, emeralds? Where are they going to get wood? Where are they going to get their tools? If they don't have these things as slaves, and they don't get them from the Egyptians, again, they have to get them on the road. But from where? I mean, think about, for example, just the ephod. 12 semi-precious stones on that. Where are they going to get those? They didn't know they needed to have semi-precious stones. The commandment hadn't come yet. So they didn't ask the Egyptians. The Egyptians didn't give it to them. Where is it coming from? The answer is a mine. And there is one turquoise and semi-precious stone mine. One on their way. Only one. And in that same area, they got lots of elbow room. They can camp at the base of the mountains. They got plenty of water too. Okay? There's even a place nearby with a bunch of palm trees and springs, like Elim. Okay? And by the way, Paleo-Hebrew inscriptions all over the place, as well as the script that preceded Paleo-Hebrew. But for other clues about where Mount Sinai is, we just need to go back to the Torah text itself. Leviticus 7, verse 37 through 38 says, "This is the Torah of the burnt offering, which Yahweh commanded Moshe on Mount Sinai in the wilderness of Sinai." Right? So the mountain and the wilderness are both Sinai. There is no area in Saudi Arabia that is called the Sinai Wilderness. Then or now. Next Torah clue. Exodus 17, verse 1. "And all the congregation of Israel set out on their journey from the wilderness of Sin, according to the command of Yahweh, and camped at Rephidim, and there was no water for the people to drink." Now they're not yet in the area of the mountain, where there's water. Okay? This is important because of one odd fact. We read in Exodus 17, verse 6, "See, I am standing before you there on the rock of Horeb, and you will smite the rock, and water shall come out of it, and the people will drink." But the rock of Horeb is not Mount Horeb. The rock of Horeb is not Mount Sinai. And the reason I know that is because they won't get to the area of Mount Sinai until Exodus 19. This is Exodus 17. So they're not there yet. In the third month, after the children of Israel come out of the land of Mitzrayim, on this day they came to the wilderness of Sinai. So they weren't even in the wilderness of Sinai yet. So Israel camped there before the mountain. So Rock of Horeb is not Mount Horeb, it's not Mount Sinai. And then there's the word itself. Both the wilderness of Sin and the wilderness of Sinai are derived from a Canaanite root that means moon. In Hebrew, Sinai can mean thorny, and Horeb can mean wasteland, thorny wasteland. But in Canaanite, it is the moon god. Okay? So Mount Sinai is the moon mountain in the moon wilderness, from the perspective of the people who live there. And what this also means is that that area is, from a pagan viewpoint, is already a high place. I don't think they had pagan stuff on the mountain itself, but I do think it was right below it, okay? But what kind of pagan high place was it? Well, we know the Israelites worshipped an Egyptian god when they made the golden calf. As we read in Exodus 32, verse 4, Aaron took the gold from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool and made it into a molten calf. And they said, "This is your God, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt." So if it's the God that brought them up from the land of Egypt, that means that mighty one, they thought, helped them while they were in Egypt to get out of her. It's an Egyptian god. There is, in fact, only one time in Egyptian myth that a golden calf is worshipped. So, since the Israelites are also worshiping that one time that in Egyptian myth that the golden calf is there, their praises are going to the only goddess that gives birth to a golden calf every morning. And her name is Hathor. The shrine that they're at is dedicated to the cow goddess Hathor. Why? Because Hathor is also the patron saint in Egyptian myth of miners, and it's a turquoise mine. But the prophets know all about Hathor, right? Like, for example, you remember when Joseph has the dream of the 7 lean cows and the 7 fat cows? You want to guess how many forms the cow goddess is said to take in Egyptian myth? That's right, 7. Jeremiah 46:20 says, Egypt is a pretty heifer, right? Heifer, cow goddess. But then we're told in Hosea 4:16-17 that Israel is a stubborn heifer, and Ephraim is joined to idols. But why is Ephraim singled out here and being joined to idols? Here's why. Joshua 16:10. But they did not drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer, so the Canaanites live in the midst of Ephraim to this day. The Canaanites have a husband-wife pair of deities in the center of their god universe, Baal, the storm god, and Asherah, the fertility goddess. But when the Egyptians began building shrines in Canaanite territory, the locals began calling the cow goddess Asherah. So Hathor and Asherah became the same deity. Okay? And they sometimes also called that goddess by her title, which is Lady Baal or Baalat. In Israel, the practice spread in different ways. Jeroboam in 926 BCE consulted and made 2 golden calves. Like, did they learn nothing? And he said to them, "It is too much for you to go to Jerusalem. Behold your gods, O Israel, that brought you up from the land of Egypt. Behold your gods." And who are those gods? Golden calves. And second, they gave Father Yahweh a goddess wife in some perverted forms. We found archaeologically an inscription from Israel that says, "To Yahweh and his Asherah." Now, some folks are saying, oh, it doesn't really say that. I've looked at it. It says that, okay? Most paleographers know that it definitely says Yahweh and his Asherah. Okay? If the Israelites thought Asherah was Yahweh's wife, right, and they are in a place where another aspect of Asherah, Hathor, the cow goddess is, and Hathor gives birth to a golden calf, it might explain this association that builds in Aaron's mind. He says, in seeing this, he built an altar before the idol and made a proclamation and said, "Tomorrow will be a feast in the honor of Yahweh." I could think of no other reason why Aaron would link the two in his mind. Therefore, I believe all the evidence points to Mount Sinai being in a place that had plentiful natural resources in copper, semi-precious metals, and that was already considered a high place for worship, dedicated to Hathor, and therefore dedicated to the golden calf, which explains why they would worship the golden calf. I mean, think about this. Golden calf is a very minor deity, real low on the list. why wouldn't the Israelites want to worship a more popular deity? A deity that they would have heard about in Egypt. Osiris, Thoth, Isis, one of those. No. Instead, it's this really low-level one. Why? Because the shrine was dedicated to her mother, to its mother. And there was another copper mine in another area, but it wasn't functioning at the time of the Exodus. And without the Hathor temple being at the one copper mine that we do know of, I think it's hard to understand how they would have worshipped the golden calf in the first place. So, you find the Hathor temple, you find the turquoise mine, and you find Mount Sinai. And the mine is known as Serabit el Kadim. Okay? Serabit el Kadim. And Serabit el Kadim has two mountains within 3 miles of one another. One is called Sinai, and the other one is called Horabi. Sinai and Horeb. This also raises the possibility that Sinai and Horeb may be two different mountains, but they're in the same area. They are linked. So, you talk about Moshe being on Mount Sinai, but the Israelites made a golden calf in Horeb. And if Horeb is sort of the wider area, that might explain a few things. In that area, archaeologically speaking, we have found evidence of Semitic occupation. Lena Eckenstein, who wrote a book called The History of Sinai, she's an archaeologist. She's the chief assistant to the famed archaeologist William Flinders Petrie, said another valley, marked number 7 on the map, leads to temple ruins with a path passing the mines which contain inscriptions of an early Semitic script. She also goes on to say, the tablets were in, quote, the writing of God. These are her words. And she quotes Exodus 32:16, which raises the question as to the language that the script was used. Moses, as we know, was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, Acts 7, verse 22. He was certainly familiar with hieroglyphs, and the fact that the commandments were preserved in the two texts that differ, Exodus 20, Deuteronomy 5, suggests they were written in a language that was not Hebrew. But the discovery of primitive Semitic script at Serabit itself puts a different complexion on the matter. The writing of God was possibly a Semitic script, and it's a Semitic script that is found only there. That's my comment. Her mentor, Sir William Flinders Petrie, said, the ulterior conclusion is very important, that the common Syrian workmen who could not command the skill of an Egyptian sculptor were familiar with writing at 1500 BC, and this is a writing independent of hieroglyphics and cuneiform. It finally disproves the hypothesis that the Israelites who came through this region into Egypt and passed back again could not have used writing. Because believe it or not, a lot of people were saying they didn't know how to write back then. Here we have common Syrian laborers possessing a script which other Semitic peoples of the region must be credited with knowing. William Flinders Petrie, Researches in Sinai, 1906. But one of these Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions is the key to unlocking the entire puzzle. And I have pictures of it. I've got a lot of detailed discussion on this that I'm actually going to skip over. But let me skip to the headline here. I took a look at this script, and they first tried to decipher it. The first person did was a guy named Sir Alan Gardner, did that 1916. And he basically said something to the lady, right? And then other people came on later that said death to the lady, okay? Including a modern paleographer named Dr. Chris Hurd of Pepperdine University. The thing was, nobody had deciphered all of the ancient letters that were on this inscription. Nobody, until I did it. And it was very simple to do. It was just a substitution. Once you learned what the Proto-Sinaitic equivalent letter was, the Hebrew phrases came flooding out perfectly, and I deciphered the entire thing, and I found out that it was a multi-directional script, like Egyptian hieroglyphics. If you ever see some hieroglyphics can go this way, some can go this way, some can go this way. The same thing with this inscription. It's going sort of like that, right? Multi-directional. And again, the professional academics and the scholars that preceded my translation of this, they agreed with the multi-directional aspect of the script, which would be that would be the most controversial idea, that a script could like make a U-turn or a detour and come around like that, which it does. So I'm on solid academic ground in deciphering the letters and in deciphering, the words and the multi-directionality, because they simply didn't finish the job. So what did this inscription say? It said, "The death season for the Lady Baal." That's what it says. Okay? The death time, or it's time to kill the goddess, would be a bit more of a colloquial version of that. So who else but an Israelite would say it's time to kill the goddess at a mine that is dedicated to a goddess? Is it going to be the Canaanite pagans? I don't think so. Is it going to be the Egyptian pagans? I don't think so. Who is the only group that would have done it? And it gets better, because in the script itself are hints of its age. William Flinders Petrie dated the Proto-Sinaitic letters on this inscription to between 1700 and 1400 BC. And that date has largely held up to this time, 100 years later. Here's the thing. In the script, there were two versions of the letter T. One was like this. This is the old form of the T. And this is the new form, the Paleo X. Okay, old, new. Now, when you have both versions of that letter in the inscription, what that means is, if you've got a broad date of 1700 to 1400 BC, if you know this letter, the X version, emerged in Paleo Hebrew about 1400 BC, then you're talking about a transition time where this was still used, but was still used, but it was gradually being replaced by this. Okay? What that will do is it will put you towards the end of that range, say 1500 to 1400 BCE. When is the Exodus? 1447 BCE. So you see, it's a match. Okay? It's a total match. Here is archaeological evidence of somebody who hates the pagan gods. If it's not Moshe, who is it? Could it be Aaron? Sure. Could it be her, Caleb? Could it be some unknown Israelite traveling with these folks? And also where this inscription was found is also very telling. Because the thing is that it was found on a votive jar. Okay? It was meant to be an offering to the Sphinx, right? And on one side is this the original Egyptian inscription, which basically said, to this Egyptian goddess, and blessings and blah blah blah. And it's on the other side that you have the other inscription. So somebody saw that in the first inscription and carved graffiti to the opposite meaning of what was on the other side of it, and said, "Death to the goddess." Death to the goddess. The one saying, "I love the goddess," that's what the Egyptian one says, and the other side says, "Death to the goddess." So all of these things are only possible if the Israelites circa 1450 BC, which is what the paleographic evidence points to, were in this place in Serabit el-Qadim, Mount Sinai over here, Mount Gorabi over there. That's where Mount Sinai is. And there hasn't been a whole lot of excavation there in 100 years or so. And it looks like Sinai or Sinai didn't have a whole lot of pagan stuff on it, but the other mountain, Gorabi, may have. And certainly what happened was that Moshe, he comes down from Sinai, and there's this plain, and this is where the mine is, and this is where the shrine is. And so he sees the Israelites worshiping the goddess that the shrine is dedicated to. And he breaks the tablets of the Ten Commandments as a result. So that is what I believe, where I believe Mount Sinai is. I think it matches archaeology. I think it matches geography. And it certainly matches the Torah text. Thanks very much for listening. I just wanted to say Chag Sameach once again. Have a great Pesach, whether you're doing it, this coming week in March 23rd, whether you're doing it on April 22nd. Either way, I wish you a wonderful holiday. Thanks for supporting One Faith, One People Ministries, and have a joyous, joyous time. Take care, and shalom.